I want to preface this by saying that I will be discussing both Sifu and Elden Ring, but will be avoiding any spoilers. The gameplay in the background will be from early parts of the game, and it's from the IGN YouTube channel because my computer isn't powerful enough to record my gameplay. I really do hope that if you haven't yet, you try and experience these games yourself. I experienced both games going in completely blind, and I think that my enjoyment of the games benefited from it. But before that, I want to talk about one of the things that I find fascinating about video games, and that is the role of failure and how pivotal it is to an enjoyable game experience. Sure, there's games like Animal Crossing that make it feel like you never truly fail, but in most games, failure is a necessary part to an enjoyable game. Without failure, players never get to feel success. A win without the risk of a loss doesn't feel like a true win, and in all honesty, it feels boring. I'm sure you've experienced this in-game before. A quick example could be like when a multiplayer match becomes too easy, to the point where there's no sort of resistance from the enemy team. I personally don't feel any sort of accomplishment from that win. Another example comes from Pokemon, as when you beat that one NPC that has just Magikarps, you don't feel as accomplished as when you beat Cynthia. For many, the problem arises with finding a balance. Winning feels great and makes you happy, but losing sucks and makes you unhappy, or many times, angry. It's up to devs to find that middle ground where a game challenges you to the point where the win becomes earned. One can assume that most players want at the very least the risk of failure. And this ties in well to a theory known as reversal theory, which states that people seek low arousal and normal goal-directed activities such as work or school, but high arousal and hence challenge and danger, and activities performed for their intrinsic enjoyment, such as games. I find it intriguing what this means for a rewarding experience with video games, because one could assume that the player would go out of their way to make the game more challenging for themselves. And some do, whether it's beating an Elden Ring boss without getting hit, or doing a Sifu run where you can't die. Some players will go the extra mile and self-impose some challenges, but it turns out that most players won't. According to game designer David Jav, who's worked on titles such as Twisted Metal and the 2005 and 2007 God of War games, Jav can be quoted as saying, "Players will not use any mechanic they do not need to use. They will take the path of least resistance to get to A to B." This all leads to a very complicated conundrum in games, as players want to fail as well as win, but players do not seek out additional challenges or depth if they don't have to. And to add to this, research and studies show that it can't be any failure, as players have to feel at least somewhat responsible for failing. This is partly why some failures feel worse than others, such as lag or issues in character balancing, as these are completely out of our control and thus make us frustrated. And I think this is where the disconnect happens for many with games like Sifu and Elden Ring, because Elden Ring and Sifu are designed to where the path of least resistance still has quite a bit of resistance. The games are inherently difficult for most. For many, the types of losses that these games hand out feel unearned or out of our control. Bosses doing insane damage or being chain comboed from 100 to 0 can honestly feel pretty shitty. I know it's what turned me off from these types of games for a long time. Seeing people get obliterated because the game was designed like that didn't seem enjoyable to me. But what I didn't realize until recently was that this is the game's way of helping you acknowledge that what you're currently doing isn't working and you need to readjust. Fans of these types of games know the game is punishing you for a misplay and not handing out random losses or failure. So, what makes this fun? This is where the other role of failure comes in, and one that I personally didn't think of too much until I started doing research for this video, and that is content. In an academic paper titled Fear of Failing: The Many Meanings of Difficulty in Video Games, the author goes on to talk about how failure forces players to readjust their perception of a game, forcing players to find nuances to the game. He calls this content due to the fact that readjusting and coming up with new ways to improve keep you playing. And while not always making progress in the story, they do help make progress as a player. This is showcased in situations like difficult boss battles, where many times you go in with the sole purpose of wanting to learn the moveset of said boss, and using that knowledge to overcome them eventually with enough repetition. Or, to give you another example and stick with the Pokemon theme from earlier, It'd be like going back to tall grass in order to find Pokemon that will make a gym battle easier because of type advantage. Failure adds content. I think both Sifu and Elden Ring masterfully integrate this form of content to the gameplay. Both games reward players for admitting defeat, getting back up, and then working on either mastering the tools given to you or finding new tools that will make it easier to overcome whatever bested you. Sifu does this with the permanent unlock system in their skill tree, where players can invest XP points into making sure that later runs will start with an already unlocked ability instead of having to start from scratch. And Elden Ring has a few subtle ways of doing this too, as it has most of its bosses in no specific order, so if one boss is too hard, it's completely possible to avoid them until you find better loot by taking on others or farming XP. I actually had around 15 hours before I even tried my hand at the first mandatory boss, and I benefited so much from being overleveled. It also allows you to pick up XP you lost on death, but you'll have to travel to the area you lost it in, as if FromSoft is challenging the player to give it another go. But players aren't forced to use these tools if they don't want to. The game doesn't punish you for bashing your head into a boss until they fall. Coinciding with failure is difficulty, which in this conversation usually refers to how easy it is to fail or how much one is forced to fail. Difficulty is interesting because much like failure, there isn't just one type of difficulty. And I don't mean this in an easy, medium, hard type of way, but rather in why something is difficult. Professor Patrick Jagoda talks about this in his paper on difficulty in video games, mechanics, interpretation, effect, where he highlights 3 different types of difficulties in video games, those being mechanical, interpretive, and effective. I want to focus on 2 specific ones here, those being mechanical and effective, as I think the 2 games do an amazing job at explaining them. First up is mechanical difficulty, and this is the one that everyone thinks about when talking about difficulty in video games. This difficulty comes from how easy or hard the game makes it to perform the correct actions or skills. And each genre comes with its own set of genre-specific mechanical difficulties, whether it's how well you can control your vehicle in a racing game, to how fast and accurately you can hit a target in first-person shooters. This is a sort of difficulty that most people refer to when talking about Elden Ring and Sifu, and it's clear why. The games require specific actions taken at precise moments, or else you're punished harshly. The intensity of these games in their mechanical difficulty is largely why the conversation about difficulty is had. Graythorn, a fellow video creator, has an amazing video on how we as a gaming culture have assigned meaning and value to games based on their perceived difficulty. It will be linked in the description, and I highly recommend it. And I'll admit, personally, I find these games pretty damn mechanically difficult. I consider myself a vet when it comes to gaming, and have experience with games that get tricky such as Super Meat Boy, or legendary Halo campaigns with a bunch of skulls turned on, but I still find myself struggling in both Sifu and Elden Ring from time to time. This difficulty, when tied in with effective difficulty and the way it's handled in both games, makes for an experience that very few games can replicate. So, what is effective difficulty? I don't think I can word this any better than Professor Jagoda, so I'm going to directly quote him for this part. Effective difficulty introduces intensities that test or even unravel the player. While players and critics often imagine resolving other types of difficulty, effective difficulty is irresolvable. It may intersect with the mechanical pleasures of victory or interpretive engagement, but it also activates experiences of boredom, disenchantment, fear, shame, and even disgust. Games can produce annoyance, anxiety, or something as common as rage quitting. They inspire everything from delighted curiosity to deep addiction. They can require orientations of flexible optimism. They can captivate us with connective feelings, apophenia, or darker entanglements, paranoia. They can allow us to think through complicated circumstances, empathize with others, and experiment with unfamiliar experiences. To summarize, and put it very shortly, it's the way the game makes us feel, and the way those feelings impact the way we play a game. And this is where Sifu and Elden Ring hit a home run. The feelings that the game's mechanical difficulty, aesthetics, and gameplay can give you is like no other. Sifu takes inspiration from classic martial arts movies. It wears its inspirations on its sleeve, and fans of the genre will be able to instantly tell the callbacks. But it isn't just scenes, it's themes and tropes too. Constant training in order to master yourself and your skill is commonplace in martial art movies, and Sifu replicates this feeling with the way you unlock abilities, encouraging you to go back to missions, get XP, and slowly unlock things. and from a page stolen straight out of Mr. Miyagi's handbook to karate, Sifu forces players to master the basics of combat in order to find success. Without spoiling too much, different enemies force you to do different parts of basic combat if you want to beat them. It also leads to these moments where you hit a state of flow, much like when it finally clicks for LaRusso as to why Miyagi trained him the way he did. It's an amazing feeling that also plays into the aesthetic of the game. Sifu found a way to spin what is usually described as grinding into something that ties back into the narrative of the game. It's one reason I love it. It never feels like grinding. It feels like I'm leaning into the power fantasy of a martial artist, where the training montage begins because the protagonist must get stronger. And when I lose, sure, it might be frustrating, but I gain new insight on what I must do or not do in order to find success next time. Elden Ring, on the other hand, takes inspiration from dark fantasy, dropping you in an unfamiliar, hellish landscape filled with grotesque and frightening creatures that force the players to feel insignificant and weak, where a regular enemy in this game feels like it could be a boss in another. The game does an amazing job at highlighting just how fragile you are at times, and it helps sell the fact that bosses here will kill you if you mess up. It forces you to respect and even fear the enemies and bosses in the game. But it makes beating bosses that much more rewarding. It's straight out of classic storytelling. It's David beating Goliath. You were never supposed to beat this unsurmountable giant creature, but you did. Each boss battle feels like you reached the climax of the hero's journey, where you're closer to death than you've ever been and in more danger than ever before. It's just like fantasy novels. These two games found this perfect spot where you're able to test your skill, and if you currently aren't good enough, you can be, but you'll need to work on it. These two games found a way to make losing not feel like a setback, but instead a lesson, and it's so much damn fun. Hey guys, that wraps up this short video essay. It's my first one, and it was so much fun researching and putting my thoughts to paper. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope you give these games a try. Everything that I referenced here will be in the description below, so if possible, please check it out. I learned so much and had a fun time reading into the topic. Please let me know any thoughts you have about the video. Like I mentioned before, it's my first one, and any constructive criticism is welcome. The nicer you word it, the better though. Finally, it goes without saying, but thank you for watching. It means a lot. Smell you later.